On a gentle March afternoon, the ancient trees in Greenfield Park whispered softly in the breeze. On a stone bench near the lake, Mrs. Agnes Muller, a woman of color in her 70s, sat quietly. Her worn wool coat and frayed scarf spoke of simplicity and frailty. She was reading a thin book, her face calm, her eyes tinged with nostalgia. No one, not even she, could have guessed that this peaceful afternoon would turn into a nightmare. From the park gate, two police officers, Eric Donovan and Marcus Keller, entered. Both wore uniforms, but their demeanors were markedly different. Eric, tall and stern, constantly scanned the surroundings with a gaze that treated everyone as a potential threat. Marcus, younger, was more impatient and prone to outbursts. "There, that's her," Eric said quietly, pointing toward Mrs. Agnes. "Matches the description: female, elderly, person of color, suspected of involvement in this morning's theft on Anders Street." Marcus frowned. "You sure? She's just sitting there. We're not taking chances." "Confirm her identity on the spot." Without a greeting or introduction, the two officers approached. Eric spoke coldly. "Show us your ID." Mrs. Agnes looked up, a little flustered. I'm just sitting here resting." "What's going on?" "We're conducting an investigation." "Cooperate or we'll have to use force," Marcus interjected tensely. Before Mrs. Agnes could even reach for her bag, Eric had already grabbed her wrist. She panicked. "Wait, I haven't done anything wrong." But Eric tightened his grip and yanked her to her feet. Her frail body lost balance and collapsed onto the stone-paved path. A startled cry escaped her lips, catching the attention of nearby passers-by. A few phones were pulled out. From across the park, Leon Hartmann, former world boxing champion, had just finished a strength training session. At 56, he still carried a solid frame and razor-sharp eyes. Leon cherished these peaceful moments in the park, a place where he could escape the spotlight and fame for a while. The cries and scuffle made him pause. From a distance, he saw an elderly woman being roughly handled by the police. Her face made him flinch, not because he knew her, but because of the fear and helplessness in her eyes, emotions he had once seen in the mirror as a street kid, judged solely for his skin color and past. Leon walked briskly toward them. "Stop," he said. His voice was deep, clear, and firm. Eric spun around. "This is police business. Step aside." "What has she done wrong?" Leon asked. Marcus jerked his chin. "Suspected of involvement in a theft this morning." Leon glanced at Mrs. Agnes, her face darkened from the fall, her eyes terrified. "Any confirmation? Any evidence? Or is it just because she matches a description?" Eric clenched his jaw and moved closer to Leon. But Marcus hesitated, suddenly recognizing the familiar face. "Eric, I think that's Leon Hartmann," he whispered. Recognition spread quickly through the crowd. Murmurs rose. "That's Leon Hartmann. He's standing up for the old lady. Record this." Eric tried to stay composed. "You might be famous, but if you obstruct law enforcement, you'll be arrested." Leon remained unshaken. "And what if you're wrong? If your actions today are seen by the world, are you ready to take responsibility?" A tense silence fell. Then Leon turned to Marcus. "Take off the cuffs. She's clearly no threat." Marcus looked at Eric, then at the crowd recording them. He hesitated, then stepped back. Eric cursed under his breath but let go. Leon helped Mrs. Agnes up, his eyes softening. "Are you all right?" She nodded gently, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Thank you. If you hadn't come, I don't know what would have happened." Eric, furious, pulled out his radio, preparing to call for backup when the sound of a police siren pierced the air. A patrol car entered the park. Out stepped Senior Inspector Victor Stein, head of the Regional Rapid Response Unit. He frowned at the scene before him. "What's going on here?" Marcus started to speak, but Leon stepped forward. "They assaulted an innocent woman without verification. No evidence, no respect, only prejudice and force." Victor looked around, the crowd, the phones recording, Mrs. Agnes's shaken face, and Leon's unwavering gaze. "Donovan, Keller, back to headquarters. We'll talk there." That afternoon, Greenfield Park had returned to its calm, but the echoes of the incident continued to spread like wildfire. On social media, videos of the event went viral. The hashtags #JusticeForAgnes and #LeonStandsForJustice trended on the front pages. In the interrogation room at the Bergstadt City Police Headquarters, Inspector Victor Stein sat across from officers Eric Donovan and Marcus Keller. The cold fluorescent lights cast a stark glare on their tense faces. "What exactly were your actions based on?" Victor asked, his voice low but sharp. Eric leaned back in his chair, trying to maintain composure. "We had a description from the theft on Anders Street. Female, person of color, over 60, gray coat, wearing a scarf. Agnes Muller matched every detail. A photo, or just a verbal description? Victor cut in. A witness's verbal description. And you thought that was enough reason to use force on someone calmly sitting on a bench? Eric said nothing. Marcus shifted uneasily. She reacted when we asked for ID. We were afraid she might run. Victor tapped his pen lightly on the table. I've seen the video. She had no chance to react. You grabbed her wrist before she even finished her first sentence. The air grew heavy. Victor placed a file on the table. Both of you have prior complaints on record. Last year, a black student stopped without cause outside a dorm. The year before, an altercation with a homeless man. Both cases shelved due to lack of evidence. Eric clenched his jaw. I was following procedure. Procedure doesn't include throwing an elderly woman to the ground. Meanwhile, at Bergstadt City Hospital, Mrs. Agnes Muller was being examined for injuries. A doctor gently wrapped her wrist in a bandage. Leon Hartmann sat beside her, a contemplative look in his eyes. Do you have any family I can contact for you? Leon asked. Mrs. Agnes shook her head weakly. My husband passed away last year. My daughter's in France, but I don't want to bother her. I've been doing fine. Until today. Leon nodded. You won't face this alone. Not while I'm here. She took his hand, eyes brimming with tears. Thank you. You have no idea what you've done for me. Leon offered a quiet smile. I know too well what it feels like to be treated like a threat, just because you look different. The next day, an emergency meeting was called at police headquarters. The press gathered en masse. Local residents protested outside the gates. Inspector Victor Stein held a press conference. We confirm that the use of force against Mrs. Agnes Muller was improper and unjustified. Officers Eric Donovan and Marcus Keller have been placed on temporary suspension pending an internal investigation. There will be no cover-up. We will do what's right. Behind him, Leon Hartmann stepped forward, uninvited, without ceremony. He approached the podium. No script, no notes, just the truth. What we saw yesterday wasn't the behavior of an entire police force. It was the result of a system that allows some to carry power without accountability. I'm no hero. I'm just someone who saw something wrong and couldn't turn away. But today I want everyone, especially the good officers out there, to understand. Silence is complicity. He looked straight into the cameras. If there had been no cameras, no crowd, no one to speak up, where would she be now? And how many others have suffered the same way, in silence? 3 weeks into Bergstadt's reform program, the atmosphere remained tense. During the mandatory training sessions, some officers listened attentively, trying to understand the deeper reasons behind the reforms. But many, especially the veteran officers, attended only because they were required to. On the second floor of the Central Police Headquarters, a closed-door meeting took place among senior officers. The meeting was led by Karl Reiner, former tactical training instructor and close friend of suspended officer Eric Donovan. Karl looked around the room, his voice low, laced with frustration. We're being humiliated. By the media, by civilians, and by some ex-boxer who thinks he's a hero. There were a few nods, some scoffs of agreement. One officer spoke up. I've worn this badge for 20 years, and now I'm supposed to learn how to maintain cultural distance with someone I'm checking? Meanwhile, they get to film me and smear my name in public. Karl stood, tapping the table lightly with his hand. We don't need to overthrow anyone, but we can't just sit here and be painted as violent thugs. If it weren't for us, this city would have fallen apart long ago. The tension in the room thickened. A crack had formed, not loud, not public, but smoldering. Resistance didn't come through violence. It came through silence, delay, and quiet disengagement. Meanwhile, across town at a public high school, Mrs. Agnes Muller and Leon Hartmann were holding a dialogue with students. More than 200 young people filled the auditorium, sitting in absolute silence as Mrs. Agnes recounted the fateful day in Greenfield Park. Her voice was soft, devoid of anger. Only truth remained. When I was thrown to the ground, no one came running. Some filmed it. Some looked away. I don't blame them. I used to be like them, thinking, that's not my business. But now I know. If everyone thinks that way, justice will always be out of reach. Leon stood beside her, calm as ever. Change doesn't begin in Parliament. It starts in the minds of every person in this room. One person who refuses to look away can make 10 others stand up. The applause came not from adults but from children, the ones yet untouched by prejudice, and therefore the most open to change. That night, at police headquarters, Victor Stein received an internal report. An anonymous complaint alleged that some officers were quietly undermining the reform efforts, skipping proper documentation, delaying civilian requests, pretending not to receive complaints. Victor stared at the report, his heart heavy. He knew this would happen, just not so soon. Not because those officers were cruel, but because they were afraid of change, afraid of losing the power they'd grown used to, afraid of facing themselves. The next morning, he summoned the entire command staff. In the meeting room, sunlight streamed through the large windows. Victor stepped to the front, his gaze sweeping across familiar faces. I know some of you don't agree with what's happening. Some are staying silent in protest. Some are stalling the change the city is asking for. But let me ask you one thing. How many of you joined this job out of pride? So your children, your partners, your parents could look at you in uniform and feel proud. The room was quiet. If the answer is yes, then throwing an elderly woman to the ground, or staying silent in the face of complaints, that doesn't get you there. It makes us into what society fears most, a force stripped of humanity. He took a breath. This is no longer the time for silence. It's the time for responsibility. Anyone working against that doesn't belong here anymore. After the meeting, Carl Reiner stood alone in the hallway, eyes fixed on the door that had just closed. He said nothing, but something inside had shifted. That night, he pulled out old reports and reviewed each ignored complaint. One letter, handwritten in shaky lines, caught his eye. I don't blame them, but I wish someone in that interrogation room had once been a husband, a father. Maybe then they wouldn't have yelled at me when all I wanted was to see my son. Carl placed the letter down, silent. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sharp ache in his chest. At a small police reform forum hosted by the city's reform committee, something happened for the first time. A police officer voluntarily stepped forward to speak. Lieutenant Anna Berger, a young female officer, took the podium. I used to be afraid I'd be isolated for supporting reform. But then I realized silence doesn't protect anyone. It only protects what's wrong. Leon nodded from the crowd. A small light, but one bright enough to shine through the cracks. Cracks that were becoming more visible by the day. On a quiet Saturday evening, the Lindenstrasse neighborhood on the west side of Bergstadt erupted with chaos, shouts, sirens, and flashing red-blue lights. On the sidewalk, Elias Romero, a 17-year-old Latino teenager, was slammed to the ground, hands cuffed behind his back. Two police officers, Paul Heinz and Tobias Fuchs, restrained him while bystanders shouted in protest. The boy was just riding his bike, a woman screamed. He didn't do anything. A middle-aged man filmed the scene, his voice choked. You're doing it again. Again. Within hours, the video of Elias being pinned down, his face bloodied against the curb, spread like wildfire across social media. The hashtag Justice for Elias exploded. The comments, angry, heartbroken, full of doubt. At police headquarters, Victor Stein sat in his office when the phone rang, sharp, urgent tones. The caller was Lieutenant Anna Berger, the same officer who had spoken out for reform just weeks prior. Her voice was tight with unease. Chief Stein, we have a major situation. And this time, it's worse than Agnes. By the next morning, the emergency meeting room was once again filled. Leon Hartmann sat alongside members of the reform committee. On the screen before them, the video played in slow motion, Elias's bloodied face, a mother's scream echoing in the background. Elias has no criminal record. No sign of wrongdoing. He was just a kid with dark skin wearing a hoodie. Anna Berger spoke without taking her eyes off the screen. Victor's voice was taut. The officers claimed he matched the description of a suspect in a supermarket robbery 2 hours earlier. Leon leaned back, fingers interlocked, then asked calmly. Matched how? Because of the hoodie? Or because he wasn't white? No one answered. Leon stood, his eyes sharp. How far have we really come if it only takes one night to bring us right back to where we started? Mayor Elena Voss called in during the meeting, her voice resolute on speakerphone. I want an independent investigation. Public. Transparent. And if the actions are confirmed to be unjustified, I expect a formal apology from the police department. If we back down now, every step we've taken toward reform becomes meaningless. 3 days later, Leon visited Elias in the hospital. The boy lay there, his face bruised, his eyes red but dry. I didn't do anything, Elias whispered. I was just biking. And now people online look at me like I'm a criminal. Leon sat beside him, exhaling slowly. The truth gets distorted sometimes. But your voice helps keep it from being buried. And what if no one believes me? Leon met his gaze. Then I'll be the first to believe you. And I promise I won't be the only one. At the press conference 3 days later, Victor Stein stood beside Leon Hartmann and Anna Berger, facing a crowd of journalists and cameras. After reviewing the evidence, we confirmed that the detention of Elias Romero was not in accordance with protocol, nor was it justified. On behalf of the police force, I offer an apology to Elias and his family. He paused briefly. The 2 officers involved have been suspended and their case referred to an independent disciplinary board. In addition, we are inviting Elias and his family to participate in a direct dialogue with the Reform Committee. His story will not be forgotten. Leon stepped forward, his tone calm, not inciting outrage, just speaking the truth everyone was thinking. We can't call this a setback if we refuse to look away. This is a test not of the system but of our trust. And trust isn't rebuilt by words, it's rebuilt by how we respond to failure. That evening, Elias and his mother attended a community forum organized by the Reform Committee. No one asked them to speak, but Elias requested the microphone. His voice trembled, but he stood firm. I don't want to be a victim forever. I want to use what happened to me to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. In that crowded room, the same room where Mrs. Agnes once shared her story, a new voice emerged. Young, wounded, but brave. Leon nodded gently. The cracks in the system were now visible, but the light was still finding its way through. On a cold, rainy evening, the Reform Committee convened an emergency meeting. The echo of tapping pens filled the dimly lit City Hall conference room, the amber glow of ceiling lamps doing little to warm the heavy air. On the table lay a thick file stamped, "Internal use only," a petition from the Bergstadt Police Union. Elena Voss set the printed document down. Her voice was tight, controlled beneath layers of frustration. 112 officers signed this. They're demanding a suspension of the entire reform program, claiming it's causing psychological strain and division within the ranks. Anna Berger clenched her fists. This isn't quiet resistance anymore. It's organized. This is a front line. Victor Stein sat motionless, his sharp eyes fixed on nothing in particular. I warned this would come. Some aren't resisting because they don't understand. They resist because they do understand that if reform succeeds, their world won't look the same. Leon Hartmann walked toward the window, where city lights bled across rain-streaked glass. His voice was soft but rang clear. We're facing something without a name. No spokesperson, no banner. But it's everywhere. In hallways, in looks, in incomplete reports, and accidentally lost radio contact patrols. This is the silent front. In the corner of the room, Mrs. Agnes, wrapped in her familiar blue scarf, spoke, her voice steady as steel. What scares me most isn't those who hate justice. It's those who know and still stay quiet. They are the walls that let injustice stand. The next morning, Bergstadt Post, typically neutral, ran an editorial, "Reform or Division, a city at the crossroads." It didn't openly oppose the reforms, but subtly questioned whether these changes were truly improving the city or just stirring unrest within law enforcement. Social media lit up with fierce debate. Some posted photos of Elias and Mrs. Agnes in support of reform. But others, anonymous or not, began resurfacing old, distorted stories aimed directly at Leon Hartmann. One viral video showed Leon in the 1990s, smashing a podium after a bitter boxing defeat. The caption dripped with malice. The man who once lost control now lectures others about restraint? Leon had expected backlash, but not this cruel. He said nothing publicly. He simply sat in his kitchen, rewatching that clip of his younger self. full of rage, misunderstood, misjudged. He whispered to himself, "No different from Elias." 3 days later, another blow struck. Mira Scholes, a young officer who had publicly supported reform, found her car vandalized outside her home. On the windshield, spray painted in red, "Justice is not betrayal." The community erupted. No one claimed responsibility. No one was arrested. No camera had been working that night. Mira took an indefinite leave and left the city. In his office, Victor slammed a fist on the desk. "This isn't opposition anymore. This is intimidation." Leon stood beside him, voice low but resolute. "And this is the moment we must stand taller than ever." At a rare public press conference held in Bergstadt's Central Square, Victor, Elena, Leon, and Mrs. Agnes stepped onto the podium together. Elena opened, "We know reform is never easy, but those who act in the shadows do not represent the force as a whole. And we, instead of retreating, will move toward the light stronger." Leon followed, "Justice cannot be threatened. We're not perfect, but we will not stay silent. Because silence is what allowed injustice to last this long." That night, Elias sat alone on the rooftop of his apartment building. Staring out at the distant lights, he opened his phone and typed a single tweet. "If they use silence to hide mistakes, I'll use my voice to expose the truth." The line spread fast, becoming the unofficial motto of a movement surrounded by strategic silence. The next battle wouldn't take place in courtrooms or police stations. It would happen in the hearts of communities, between those who chose silence and those who chose to stand. April 15th. The wind in Bergstadt howled down every street, whipping through flagpoles and rattling the tall windows of City Hall. But it wasn't the only storm rising. Inside the municipal hall, the same room where Leon Hartmann and Mrs. Agnes once first spoke, a public hearing was held. For the first time, the Reform Committee, community leaders, city officials, and the police union sat face to face. No closed doors, no anonymity. More than 300 people were there in person. Tens of thousands watched via TV and livestream. Everyone knew the outcome of this hearing would define the future of the reform movement. The session began at 9 a.m., presided over by State Representative Claudia Reinhardt. Once neutral, now forced to balance between two clashing tides, reform and status quo. Representing the conservative police faction was Karl Reiner, former internal training commander, a veteran with 25 years of service. He stepped to the podium, his tone clipped, his presence controlled. "I don't oppose reform because I fear change. I oppose it because it damages the honor and morale of those who've given their lives to this city. We're called inhuman, yet we stand at the front lines daily. If someone fails, hold them accountable. Don't punish an entire force." Applause broke from part of the crowd. Some officers in plainclothes nodded. Then Leon Hartmann took the stage. No notes, no suit, just a plain shirt and eyes that didn't flinch. "I'm not here to deny the sacrifices of the police. I'm here to ask, does that honor include slamming a guiltless boy to the ground? Throwing an elderly woman down for matching a description? If a system cannot reflect on itself, it isn't worthy of defense." Silence fell. Only the wind could be heard beyond the walls. Leon continued, "We are not divided by reform. We are divided by the fear of losing power we were never asked to justify. But justice cannot be built on fear. It must be built on responsibility." Next came Elias Romero. In a white shirt with a faint scar still visible above his brow, he stood, voice trembling but strong. "I don't hate the police, but I fear power that answers to no one. If no one had spoken up for me, I'd have been forgotten, like so many before me. So I'm standing here to say, don't let silence swallow the next person." In the audience, Elias's mother held Mrs. Agnes's hand tightly. They didn't speak, but their eyes burned brighter than any light in the room. The hearing reached its peak as Representative Reinhardt rose and walked to the center of the hall. She said nothing at first. She looked at each row, officers, journalists, survivors, the voiceless. Then she spoke, slowly, but with unwavering clarity. This city stands before a wall. On one side is the past, where reputation required no explanation. On the other is the future, where power must walk with transparency. The question isn't if we go forward. The question is, with whom do we dare to go forward? 3 days later, the city council voted 9-2 to continue the reform program, expanding it statewide if Bergstadt's model proved effective within 12 months. The legislation was signed into trial policy, officially named the Agnes Elias Act. A week later, Karl Reiner resigned. In his open letter, he wrote, "I'm not against progress. I just don't know where I belong in the world it's building." One windy afternoon, Leon returned to Greenfield Park. He walked slowly, not from fatigue, but deep thought. Mrs. Agnes was already seated on their usual bench. She looked up and smiled. "You know," she said, "I never thought wind could blow through concrete, but now, I believe it can." Leon sat down beside her. "The wind blows strongest at the top of the wall, right before it falls." April 15th. The weather in Bergstadt was unseasonal. Strong winds swept through every street, tilting the flagpole in the central square and rattling the tall windows of City Hall. But that wasn't the only storm brewing. Inside the city's main assembly hall, the same place where Leon Hartmann and Agnes Muller had once made their first speeches, a public hearing was underway. It was the first time that the Reform Committee, community representatives, city government, and the police unions sat face to face. No more backrooms, no more anonymity. Over 300 people were present. Tens of thousands watched via live broadcast and stream. Everyone understood the outcome of this hearing would decide the future of reform in Bergstadt. The session began at 9 a.m. Presiding over it was State Representative Claudia Reinhardt, once neutral, now forced to balance the scales between two opposing tides, reform and preservation of the status quo. Representing the conservative faction of the police was Karl Reiner, former head of internal training, a veteran officer with over 25 years of service. He stepped up to the podium, his expression calm, his voice clipped and firm. "I don't oppose reform because I fear change. I oppose it because it's damaging the honor and morale of those who have dedicated their lives to the safety of the city. We are called inhuman, yet we're the ones standing on the front lines every day. If someone makes a mistake, hold them accountable. But don't punish the entire force." Applause rose from part of the audience. Toward the back, several officers in plain clothes nodded in agreement. Next, Leon Hartmann took the floor. No speech in hand. No suit. Just a simple shirt and a gaze that didn't waver. "I'm not here to deny the sacrifices of the police. I'm here to ask. Does the honor Mr. Reiner speaks of include slamming an innocent boy to the ground? Does it include throwing an elderly woman down just because she fit a description? If a system can't examine itself, then it's not worthy of being defended." The room fell utterly silent, save for the wind whistling through the window cracks. Leon continued. "We are not divided by reform. We are divided by the fear of losing power that was never required to answer to anyone. But justice cannot be built on fear. It must be built on responsibility." Then came Elias Romero. He wore a white shirt. A faint scar still marked his eyebrow. His voice trembled but rang clear. "I don't hate the police, but I fear those with power and no oversight. If no one had spoken up for me, I would have been forgotten like so many others. So I'm standing here to say, don't let silence swallow the next person." In the crowd, Elias's mother held Mrs. Agnes's hand. Neither spoke, but their eyes glowed brighter than any light in the room. The climax came when Representative Reinhardt stood and walked to the center of the hall. She said nothing at first. She looked row by row at officers, journalists, survivors, and those yet to speak. Then she spoke, slowly but with unwavering clarity. "This city stands before a wall. On one side is the past, where reputation needed no explanation. On the other is the future, where power must walk hand in hand with transparency. The question isn't whether we move forward. The question is, with whom do we dare to move forward?" 3 days later, the city council voted 9-2 in favor of continuing the comprehensive reform program with a clause to expand it statewide if Bergstadt's model proved effective within 12 months. The proposal was signed into law as a pilot decree titled the Agnes Elias Act. Karl Reiner resigned 1 week later. In his open letter, he wrote, "I'm not against progress. I just don't know where I still stand in the world it's building." That same week, Leon returned to Greenfield Park on a windy afternoon. He walked slowly, not out of fatigue, but deep thought. Agnes Muller was already seated at their familiar bench. She looked up and smiled. "You know," she said, "I never believed wind could pass through concrete. But now, I believe it can." Leon sat beside her and replied softly. "The wind blows strongest at the top of the wall, right before it falls." 1 month had passed since the Agnes Elias Act officially took effect. There were no more protests. No more camera crews chasing every meeting. The major news outlets had moved on to elections, the economy, sports. But inside Bergstadt, the silence this time was genuine, peaceful. At police headquarters, training sessions continued regularly. No more covert resistance. No excitement either. What remained was caution, a kind of quiet that resembled either healing or fatigue. Leon Hartmann still attended the Reform Committee's meetings, but his eyes now held less steel and more reflection. After each session, he often left early. No speeches. No cameras. One quiet weekend afternoon, he passed Greenfield Park. Mrs. Agnes wasn't there. The familiar bench stood empty, only a few dry leaves and the sound of children biking nearby remained. In the Lindenstrasse neighborhood, Elias Romero had returned to school. Curious looks still lingered, but they were slowly replaced by acceptance. During a homeroom session, the teacher invited Elias to share his experience. He said little. But he brought his old hoodie, the one that led others to judge him, and placed it on the desk. "I keep it," he said, "because I want to remember what it felt like to be swallowed by silence. So I'll never stay silent when someone else is there." A girl stood and clapped. Then the whole class followed. Not out of pity, but because they understood. Across town at Precinct 4, Lieutenant Anna Berger led a practical training session. Officers practiced de-escalation techniques without using force. One young officer raised a hand. "Ma'am, if someone is aggressive and insulting, are we still supposed to stay calm?" Anna smiled. "How you respond says more about who you are, not who they are." That line was written on the whiteboard at the back of the room. A week later, it became the precinct's official motto. But not everyone saw the change. At a small cafe near the central square, an elderly man shook his head while reading an article about the Reform Conference. "They keep talking about justice, about community. But I still lock my doors tighter every night." The cafe owner, a black woman in her 50s, poured him more coffee and said with a soft smile, "Justice doesn't always make us feel safe right away, but it helps us live with less fear." The old man stayed silent. He didn't argue. For the first time, Agnes Muller had temporarily left the city. She was now in the southern countryside, living with her daughter and grandchildren. But she still sent regular handwritten letters to Leon. "Dear Leon, I know you feel people have forgotten. But I haven't. Elias hasn't. And this city, slowly, quietly, hasn't either. No light shines forever. But real change often takes root in the shadows." One morning, just as the sun crested in the east, Leon returned to Greenfield Park. He sat on the familiar bench. A small boy ran past and waved. "Mr. Leon, my mom says you're a good guy. Like a superhero." Leon laughed, ruffled the boy's hair. "Real superheroes," he said, "are the ones who know how to apologize and make things right." As the boy ran off, Leon looked up at the leafy canopy above. Sunlight filtered through in golden patches across the grass. A quiet light, but enough for the trees to grow. The reform in Bergstadt was no longer a media storm. It had become something deeper, a current beneath the surface, quietly changing how people treated each other, saw each other, and forgave. A city doesn't change in a night. But Bergstadt was shifting. Slowly, honestly, and without turning back. Between two dawns, one born of anger, the other of hope, the city was learning to walk forward on its own feet. One summer morning, Bergstadt was neither blazing hot nor overcast, just warm enough to fill Greenfield Park with footsteps and voices. On the familiar bench sat Leon Hartmann, quietly alone. Beside him, a thin folder, an old notebook, and a cup of cold coffee. No press conference today. No cameras. But Leon knew this morning marked a milestone. Exactly 1 year since the Agnes Muller incident. He opened the notebook. The first pages were handwritten by Agnes herself, each entry a short story, a memory from someone once misunderstood, once silenced. The notebook had been her parting gift before moving south to be with her family. She'd titled it, "The Journal of the Unasked." Leon gently ran his hand over the worn pages. His heart was still. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had learned to carry it. At Precinct 4, Lieutenant Anna Berger closed the final training session of the reform's first year. In her hand was a list of 138 officers who had completed the Nonviolent Response Program, 23 of whom were now certified trainers for the next round. She wrote on the board, clear and firm. No one is born to fear the police. A young recruit raised his hand. Ma'am, if it weren't for the reform committee, would any of this have happened? Anna smiled. If no one had stood up last year, you might be learning how to control, not how to listen. At a suburban elementary school, Elias Romero, now a student teacher in education, stood before a class for the first time. White shirt, taller frame, same steady eyes. On the board, he wrote, "Have you ever been misunderstood?" The children looked up. One girl raised her hand. "When I told the truth, but nobody believed me." Elias nodded. "Then you understand what it feels like to be seen as someone you're not." He didn't tell his story. He didn't need to. The real lesson wasn't about the past, it was how to prevent it from happening again. In Mayor Elena Voss's office, a new photo hung on the wall. It showed the historic hearing at City Hall. Leon speaking, Elias standing behind him, and Mrs. Agnes seated in the front row, her hand resting gently on her cane. Beneath the frame was a small inscription. Justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins when someone says, "I will not be silent." On the final night of summer, a small, quiet ceremony was held at Greenfield Park. No fireworks. No stage. Just a few hundred people, those who had stood up, those who once opposed but had since changed, those who had witnessed and now helped preserve. They placed tiny candles along the stone path. Each flame symbolized someone once forgotten, once misjudged, someone who stood up or was defended by another. Leon stood at the center of that glowing circle, one hand holding a candle, the other resting on a small wooden sign. We are still here, and we are still listening. No one gave a speech. No microphones. Only light, steady, quiet, illuminating a city that once screamed for change, and now was learning how to protect what it had claimed.